The morning of Eleanor Hartwell's wedding dawned with that particular clarity of light that seems to bless September days in English villages, when the air holds just enough crispness to remind one that summer is gracefully taking its leave. Miss Jane Marple, making her careful way along the cobbled path to St. Bartholomew's Church in Little Wickham, paused to admire the profusion of late roses cascading over the ancient lich gate. At 74, she had attended more weddings in this village than she cared to count, but there was something especially satisfying about this particular union. Eleanor Vance, as she had been until this morning, had served as the village librarian for nearly a decade, a sensible young woman of 28 who had quietly won the affection of nearly everyone in Little Wickham through her gentle efficiency and genuine interest in their concerns. The church was already filling when Miss Marple slipped into her customary pew, 3 rows from the back where she could observe without seeming to do so. She nodded pleasantly to the Reverend Mr. Clement, who was adjusting his surplice with the nervous precision of a man who had performed this ceremony countless times yet still felt the weight of its significance. The bride's side of the church showed a comfortable mixture of village faces and what appeared to be relatives from London, while the groom's side was more sparsely populated, Dr. Hartwell being a newcomer to Little Wickham who had taken over old Dr. Pemberton's practice only 2 years prior. Miss Marple's attention was drawn to the front pew where Eleanor's guardian, Miss Cordelia Whitmore, sat with the rigid posture that spoke of a woman who had spent her life maintaining standards in a world increasingly inclined to abandon them. Miss Cordelia had raised Eleanor after the girl's parents died in a motor accident, and while her devotion to her ward was unquestioned, there had always been something rather forbidding about the older woman's manner. She kept house in the largest cottage on Vicarage Lane and was known throughout the village for her extensive correspondence with charitable organizations and her firmly held opinions about proper conduct. The organ began its processional, and Dr. Hartwell appeared at the altar with his best man, Dr. Geoffrey Ashford, a colleague from the hospital in Much Benham, whose prematurely grey hair and cheerful demeanour provided a pleasant contrast to the groom's more serious nature. Dr. Hartwell looked appropriately nervous in his morning coat, though Miss Marple noticed that his hands, usually so steady in his medical practice, trembled slightly as he waited for his bride. Eleanor herself was radiant as she moved down the aisle on the arm of Colonel Melchett, who had agreed to give her away in the absence of any closer male relative. Her dress was simple but elegant ivory silk. Her grandmother's pearls gleamed at her throat, and beneath her delicate lace veil, her face showed that particular luminous happiness that transforms even the plainest features into something approaching beauty. When her eyes met those of her bridegroom, the smile that passed between them was so genuine that Miss Marple felt her own eyes moisten with sympathetic emotion. The ceremony proceeded with appropriate solemnity, though Miss Marple could not help but notice certain small details that her years of observation had trained her to register almost unconsciously. Miss Cordelia dabbed at her eyes more frequently than simple maternal emotion might warrant, and there was something almost grim about the way she clutched her prayer book. More intriguingly, young Timothy Whitmore, Eleanor's cousin who worked as a gardener for various households in the village, had arrived late and stood at the back of the church with an expression that seemed oddly strained for such a joyous occasion. His pale features bore what could only be described as a haunted quality, and his hands were clenched so tightly at his sides that his knuckles showed white against his dark suit. The vows were exchanged with evident sincerity, the ring placed with only the slightest tremor in the groom's hand, and when the Reverend Mr. Clement pronounced them man and wife, the kiss that sealed their union was met with spontaneous applause from the congregation. As the newly married couple processed down the aisle to Mendelssohn's triumphant march, Miss Marple found herself studying the faces around her with the idle curiosity that had become second nature over the years. The wedding party and guests moved in cheerful procession to the village hall, where Mrs. Bantry and her committee had arranged a reception that was, by Little Wickham standards, quite elaborate. tables groaned under the weight of sandwiches, savories, and an impressive array of cakes, while the three-tiered wedding cake, created by Mrs. Baker from the tea shop, occupied a place of honor decorated with white roses and trailing ivy. The afternoon sun streamed through the tall windows, casting everything in a golden glow that seemed to promise nothing but happiness ahead. Miss Marple accepted a cup of tea and found herself in conversation with Margaret Vance, Eleanor's younger sister who had travelled up from Brighton for the occasion. Margaret was flushed with excitement and the importance of her role as maid of honor, chattering about how radiant Eleanor looked and how Dr. Hartwell was surely the luckiest man alive. Miss Marple agreed appropriately, while her gaze wandered to where Miss Cordelia stood near the cake table, engaged in what appeared to be an intense conversation with Dr. Ashford. There was something about the older woman's posture, the way she held her head slightly tilted and her voice pitched just below the general conversation, that suggested their discussion was not entirely pleasant, though both maintained expressions of polite sociability. The afternoon progressed with the usual wedding festivities. Speeches were made with varying degrees of eloquence, toasts were drunk with genuine warmth, and the cake was cut with appropriate ceremony, while the photographer captured each moment for posterity. Eleanor and Dr. Hartwell moved among their guests with gracious attention, accepting congratulations and good wishes with evident pleasure. Miss Marple noticed that Eleanor seemed particularly animated when speaking with her former colleagues from the library, laughing at some shared memory and promising to return from her honeymoon in the Lake District with stories of their adventures. It was nearly 4 o'clock when the time came for the bride and groom to depart for their wedding journey. Eleanor had changed into a traveling costume of deep blue wool with a matching hat that complemented her fair coloring beautifully. She looked, if possible, even more radiant than she had in her wedding gown, her face glowing with the particular happiness of a woman who has achieved her heart's desire. The couple made their farewells, endured the traditional shower of rice and rose petals with good humor, and climbed into Dr. Hartwell's motor car amid a chorus of good wishes and the cheerful clanging of tin cans tied to the rear bumper by some enterprising young men. Miss Marple was gathering her belongings and preparing to make her own departure when the cheerful bustle of clearing away was suddenly interrupted by a commotion near the hall's side door. Mrs. Bantry was speaking in low, urgent tones to Colonel Melchett, while several other guests had formed a worried knot of concerned faces. Young Timothy, who had been helping to clear tables despite not being part of the official reception committee, had apparently stepped outside for air and failed to return. When someone had gone to look for him, they had found him collapsed in the churchyard beneath the ancient yew tree that dominated the oldest section of St. Bartholomew's grounds. Dr. Ashford, still present despite the departure of the bride and groom, had been summoned immediately and was now kneeling beside the motionless figure. Miss Marple made her way quietly toward the small crowd that had gathered at the churchyard gate, her mind already beginning to sort through the impressions of the afternoon with the methodical precision that had served her so well in the past. As she approached, she could hear Dr. Ashford's voice, professionally calm but unmistakably grave, confirming what the faces around him had already begun to suspect. Timothy Whitmore was dead, and from the doctor's preliminary examination, it appeared that his death had not been from natural causes. The joyous celebration had been transformed in a matter of moments into something dark and terrible, and Miss Marple knew with the certainty that comes from long and unfortunate experience that Little Wickham's peaceful afternoon had taken a very sinister turn indeed. As she stood at the edge of the gathering, her sharp eyes already noting the position of the body, the scattered contents of Timothy's pockets, and the peculiar expression of what might have been surprise frozen on his pale features, she reflected that it was remarkable how quickly happiness could curdle into horror, and how often the most innocent occasions provided cover for the most guilty of secrets. The news of Timothy's death spread through the remaining wedding guests with that peculiar swiftness that accompanies truly shocking events in small communities. Within minutes, the cheerful bustle of clearing away had transformed into hushed conversations and anxious glances toward the churchyard, where Dr. Ashford continued his examination beneath the ancient yew. Miss Marple observed how differently people processed such unexpected tragedy, some clustering together for comfort, while others retreated into themselves as if proximity to others might somehow make the horror more real. Colonel Melchett had taken charge with military efficiency, dispatching someone to telephone Much Benham for Inspector Slack, while ensuring that curious onlookers maintained a respectful distance from the scene. Constable Reed, who had arrived breathless on his bicycle, was doing his best to maintain order, though Miss Marple could see the young man was somewhat overwhelmed by the gravity of the situation. The transformation from wedding celebration to potential crime scene had happened so swiftly that many guests still held teacups or pieces of cake, as if uncertain whether to continue with normal activities or abandon them entirely. Dr. Ashford emerged from his examination looking grave, and Miss Marple positioned herself where she might overhear his quiet conference with Colonel Melchett. The doctor's preliminary assessment was delivered in the careful tones of a man who understood the implications of his words. Timothy appeared to have died from poisoning, though the exact nature of the toxin would require proper post-mortem examination to determine. The young man's final expression in the position of his body suggested that death had come quickly, but not without distress. This revelation sent another wave of shocked murmurs through the gathering, and Miss Marple noticed how instinctively several people glanced toward the remains of the wedding feast. The implication was obvious to everyone present, though no one wished to voice it directly. If Timothy had indeed been poisoned, the most likely source would have been something consumed during the reception, which meant that someone among their number might be responsible for such an act. The village's natural inclination toward speculation soon asserted itself, despite the grim circumstances. Mrs. Bantry was heard lamenting that such a thing should happen on Eleanor's wedding day, while others began offering theories with the mixture of horror and fascination that accompanies unexpected drama. Someone mentioned Timothy's recent win on the football pools, suggesting robbery as a motive, though Miss Marple noted this theory gained little traction among those who knew the young man well. More persistent was the whispered discussion of yew berries, though Dr. Ashford had made no mention of such a cause. Miss Cordelia Whitmore's reaction struck Miss Marple as particularly noteworthy. The older woman had received the news of her nephew's death with a composure that seemed almost unnatural under the circumstances. When Dr. Ashford had gently informed her of Timothy's condition, she had simply closed her eyes for a moment, pressed her lips into a thin line, and asked whether he had suffered. Upon being assured that death appeared swift, she had nodded once and retreated to a chair by the window, where she sat staring out at the churchyard with an expression that was difficult to interpret. Inspector Slack's arrival brought a more systematic approach to the investigation. Miss Marple had encountered the inspector on previous occasions and knew him to be competent, if occasionally hasty in his conclusions. He immediately cordoned off the area around Timothy's body and began the process of interviewing witnesses, starting with Dr. Ashford's findings and working methodically through the guest list. The inspector's examination of the scene yielded several items of potential significance. Near Timothy's body lay a narrow brass key, tarnished with age, and a length of pink twine of the sort used at the post office. A torn wedding program had fallen from his pocket, and there appeared to be traces of cake icing on his cuff. Miss Marple made careful note of these details while maintaining her unobtrusive position among the onlookers. The question of what Timothy had consumed during the reception proved more complex than initially anticipated. The informal nature of the gathering meant people had moved freely among the refreshment tables, and several witnesses recalled seeing the young man with different items at various times. Mrs. Baker mentioned noticing him in what appeared to be an earnest, possibly heated conversation with Miss Cordelia shortly before the bride and groom's departure, though she had been too distant to overhear the actual content. As the afternoon wore on and the questioning continued, Miss Marple found herself studying the faces around her with increasing interest. There was something about the entire situation that struck her as not quite right, though she could not yet identify precisely what was troubling her. The death itself was shocking enough, but there were undercurrents here that suggested complexities beneath the surface, secrets and tensions that had perhaps been building long before this supposedly joyous day had taken such a dark turn. When Inspector Slack announced that no one would be permitted to leave until preliminary statements had been taken, Miss Marple settled herself more comfortably in her chair and prepared to observe. In her experience, it was often in such moments of enforced waiting that people revealed more than they intended, and she had the distinct feeling that Timothy Whitmore's death was merely the visible tip of something much deeper and more troubling lurking beneath Little Wickham's placid surface. The systematic questioning began in earnest as Inspector Slack established himself in the small office adjoining the village hall, his methodical approach bringing a semblance of order to what had become an increasingly tense gathering. Miss Marple positioned herself where she might observe both the comings and goings of witnesses and the reactions of those still waiting to be interviewed, her knitting providing the perfect cover for her careful attention to every detail. Mrs. Baker proved an unexpectedly valuable witness when her turn came. The baker's wife had been monitoring her contributions to the wedding feast with professional pride and had therefore observed the refreshment area more closely than most. She confirmed that Timothy had approached the table several times, though she noted his behavior as oddly restless, taking food but barely touching it before setting plates aside half-finished. More significantly, she had witnessed what appeared to be an intense exchange between Timothy and Miss Cordelia near the cake table, during which the older woman had pressed what looked like a small envelope into his hands with an urgency that seemed quite out of character for such a composed lady. When questioned about this interaction, Miss Cordelia's response was measured with the precision of someone choosing each word carefully. She acknowledged the conversation, but described it merely as family concerns, claiming she had given Timothy a small sum to help manage his recent windfall from the football pools more responsibly. However, Miss Marple observed that Miss Cordelia's hands remained rigidly folded throughout her statement, and her eyes never quite met the inspector's gaze directly. The photographer, Mr. Liddon, provided what proved to be crucial testimony. While packing his equipment after the bride and groom's departure, he had seen Timothy slip into the small cloakroom adjacent to the hall's side entrance and emerge with a brown paper parcel that bore his name in pencil. The package had been tied with pink twine of the sort used at the village post office, and Timothy had tucked it inside his jacket before heading toward the churchyard. Mr. Liddon was certain about these details, as his professional eye was trained to notice such specifics, but he could not say who had placed the parcel there or when. Margaret Vance's testimony added another troubling dimension to the emerging picture. The bride's sister appeared genuinely distressed, though Miss Marple sensed her discomfort encompassed more than simple shock at Timothy's death. When pressed about her conversation with the deceased, Margaret revealed that Timothy had approached her with what she described as inappropriate questions about Eleanor's financial arrangements and future security. His inquiries had been persistent and oddly specific, asking about property settlements and inheritance matters that seemed far removed from casual wedding day conversation. She had ended their exchange as quickly as politeness allowed, finding his manner both intrusive and somehow threatening. Perhaps most intriguingly, young Albert Trent, who performed odd jobs throughout the village, reported having encountered Timothy in the churchyard the previous evening. The young man had been examining the older gravestones with unusual intensity, apparently copying information from several of the more ancient monuments into a small notebook. When Albert had approached, Timothy had quickly concealed his writing and made some excuse about admiring the stonework, but his manner had been furtive and clearly defensive. This revelation cast Timothy's recent behavior in an entirely new light, particularly when considered alongside the brass key found near his body. Miss Marple studied the tarnished object when Inspector Slack displayed it, noting its age and distinctive design. Such keys typically belong to older structures within church grounds, possibly family vaults or memorial chapels that dotted St. Bartholomew's ancient cemetery. The connection between Timothy's apparent research among the gravestones and his subsequent death seemed too deliberate to be coincidental. Dr. Ashford contributed his own observations about Timothy's demeanor during both the ceremony and reception. The young man had arrived late at the church, appearing unusually pale and agitated throughout the service. During the reception, Timothy had seemed evasive and almost hostile when the doctor attempted friendly conversation about his recent good fortune, quite different from his typically pleasant manner. As the afternoon progressed and more details emerged, Miss Marple found herself constructing a mental picture of Timothy's final days that suggested he had stumbled upon information of considerable significance. His behavior during the past week, his obvious distress at the wedding, his pointed questions about Eleanor's financial future, and his secretive research among the gravestones all indicated that he had discovered something that posed a genuine threat to someone present. The inspector's methodical approach was establishing a clear timeline of events, but Miss Marple sensed that the real truth lay not in the sequence of what had happened, but in understanding exactly what Timothy Whitmore had learned that made him dangerous enough to kill. Someone among their seemingly respectable gathering had decided that whatever secret Timothy possessed was worth murder to protect, and they had chosen Eleanor's wedding day as the perfect cover for their deadly purpose. Inspector Slack's methodical approach to the parcel mystery yielded immediate results when he dispatched Constable Reed to examine the cloakroom more thoroughly. The young constable returned with several brown paper packages, each wrapped with the same pink twine from the post office, though none bore the penciled name that Mr. Liddon had observed on Timothy's parcel. Mrs. Bantry, summoned to explain the system, described how the committee had hastily wrapped cake slices for guests who wished to take pieces home, borrowing the twine when promised ribbon failed to arrive. The improvised nature of the arrangement meant that only a few packages had been labeled, primarily for elderly guests departing early. Miss Marple suggested, with her characteristic air of making helpful conversation, that an examination of the ground beneath the yew might reveal whether Timothy had indeed consumed anything there. Inspector Slack, recognizing the practical wisdom of this approach, accompanied her to the churchyard where the lengthening shadows cast the ancient burial ground in an increasingly somber light. Their search proved immediately fruitful, revealing a scattering of white cake crumbs near the massive root system and a torn scrap of brown paper bearing the ghostly remains of penciled letters, clearly showing a T with the beginning of an I before the tear. This discovery established the method with uncomfortable certainty, though the identity of Timothy's killer remained frustratingly elusive. Someone had deliberately prepared a poisoned slice of wedding cake, labeled it with Timothy's name, and placed it where he would find it. The calculated nature of the crime suggested intimate knowledge of both Timothy's habits and the wedding day arrangements, pointing towards someone within their close-knit community rather than an outside threat. It was during the continued search of the churchyard that Constable Reed made another significant discovery. Wedged beneath a loose stone in the ancient wall separating the cemetery from the vicarage garden, he found a small leather-bound notebook that clearly belonged to Timothy. The pages contained meticulous transcriptions of gravestone inscriptions, but more intriguingly, they included detailed notes about discrepancies in burial records and family genealogies that Timothy had apparently been researching with considerable dedication. Miss Marple examined the notebook with particular interest, her sharp eyes noting the careful handwriting and systematic approach Timothy had employed. His entries focused heavily on the Whitmore family vault, that substantial stone structure dating from the early 18th century, which housed generations of the village's most prominent lineage. Timothy had documented several troubling inconsistencies in the burial records, including references to family members whose death dates conflicted with parish documents and mysterious gaps in the genealogical sequence that suggested deliberate concealment of information. When Inspector Slack confronted Miss Cordelia with these discoveries, Her reaction proved as revealing as her words. While maintaining her characteristic composure, she acknowledged Timothy's interest in family history, but dismissed it as the harmless enthusiasm of a young man with insufficient erection. However, when pressed about the brass key found near Timothy's body, her carefully controlled facade showed its first significant crack. She admitted that such a key would provide access to the family vault, and revealed that Timothy had approached her weeks earlier, requesting permission to examine the interior for genealogical research, a request she had firmly refused. This admission cast Timothy's subsequent behavior in an entirely different light. His possession of the key suggested he had obtained access through unauthorized means, possibly planning to conduct his research without permission. Miss Cordelia's defensive explanations about family privacy and respect for ancestors seemed increasingly hollow when considered alongside Timothy's obvious determination to uncover whatever secrets the vault contained. Inspector Slack's focus began to narrow decisively toward Miss Cordelia, her cold demeanor and defensive responses fitting neatly into his developing theory of a family dispute turned deadly. However, Miss Marple observed the proceedings with growing skepticism, recognizing the dangerous allure of the obvious suspect. In her extensive experience, the person who appeared most guilty was rarely the actual perpetrator, particularly in cases involving such careful planning and intimate knowledge of local circumstances. Someone had gone to considerable trouble to ensure Timothy's silence, and Miss Marple suspected that the true killer was counting on exactly this type of misdirection to escape detection, while suspicion focused elsewhere. Dusk had drawn its gentle veil over Little Wickham by the time Inspector Slack announced that Miss Cordelia would be permitted to return home under caution, though he made it clear that a formal statement would be required at Much Benham in the morning. The relief that flickered across several faces was matched by a slight tightening around the inspector's eyes, for he disliked loose ends, and Miss Cordelia, with her perfectly arranged composure and carefully chosen words, remained very much a loose end he could not yet secure. Miss Marple, who had observed the afternoon's accumulation of evidence with the patient attention of someone well-versed in human nature's complexities, merely nodded and suggested that such a trying day would benefit from everyone taking proper rest. Her seemingly innocent inquiry to Mrs. Bantry about the cake packaging arrangements proved remarkably illuminating. The committee chairwoman, eager to demonstrate that her organization bore no responsibility for the tragedy, revealed that the brown paper packages had been prepared by various volunteers throughout the morning with no central oversight. This casual arrangement meant that an additional package could have been placed at any time during the preparations when numerous people had legitimate access to the cloakroom area. More significantly, when Agnes Finch was called to examine the torn paper fragment bearing Timothy's name, her reaction was immediate and definitive. The angular, cramped lettering bore no resemblance to her own cheerful, looping script visible on the remaining packages. Someone else had deliberately labeled Timothy's deadly parcel, someone who had taken care to disguise their involvement in the morning's seemingly innocent preparations. Constable Reed's examination of Timothy's lodgings above the bakery yielded discoveries that transformed the investigation entirely. Hidden beneath loose floorboards, the young man had concealed correspondence with a London genealogical firm, detailed copies of parish records spanning several centuries, and most damning of all, a draft letter to solicitors in Much Benham regarding significant irregularities in Whitmore family property inheritance. These documents revealed systematic research with clear legal implications, suggesting Timothy had uncovered information of substantial financial significance rather than mere family curiosity. Inspector Slack's renewed questioning of Miss Cordelia became considerably sharper following these revelations, though the older woman maintained her defensive posture while demonstrating surprisingly detailed knowledge of property matters for someone who claimed to regard such things as unimportant family history. Miss Marple observed these exchanges with particular attention to physical reactions rather than spoken responses, noting how Miss Cordelia's hands betrayed increasing tension and her breathing grew shallow when certain topics arose. However, it was Miss Marple's request to examine the brass key more closely that provided the afternoon's most significant breakthrough. As Constable Reed presented the tarnished artifact on a clean cloth, Miss Marple studied it with the methodical attention she might give to an intricate piece of knitting. The key appeared authentically ancient, its ornate Gothic design speaking of considerable age, its patina consistent with decades of handling. Yet as her experienced fingers traced its contours, she detected something subtly wrong. At the very tip of one tooth, almost imperceptible to casual observation, ran a faint line that spoke not of age, but of modern manufacturing. Miss Marple recalled her nephew Raymond explaining how machine-cut keys, however skillfully made, often bore microscopic ridges where cutting tools completed their work, marks absent from older, hand-filed specimens. This tiny imperfection, invisible to Inspector Slack's cursory examination, revealed that the key was not the original vault key at all, but a carefully crafted modern copy. This discovery fundamentally altered the investigation's direction. If Timothy possessed a duplicate key, he had somehow gained access to the original long enough to have it copied, suggesting planning and cunning far beyond simple opportunistic blackmail. More importantly, it meant someone else had unknowingly facilitated his access, and that Timothy's research into the vault's secrets represented a more serious threat than anyone had yet realized. Miss Marple returned the key to Constable Reed with her characteristic placid expression, though her mind now focused intently on this quiet evidence of deeper deception. The methodical preparation required for such a copy suggested that Timothy's killer was someone who understood the value of careful misdirection, someone who had counted on suspicion falling elsewhere while they remained safely hidden among the mourning wedding guests. As the shadows lengthened and the remaining witnesses prepared to depart, Miss Marple reflected that the true murderer was likely someone who had watched Inspector Slack's investigation with satisfaction, confident that the obvious suspect would shield them from detection. The tiny mark on that brass key whispered of secrets worth killing to protect, and she suspected that Eleanor's wedding day had been chosen not for convenience, but for reasons that ran much deeper than anyone yet understood. The implications of the duplicated key weighed heavily on Miss Marple's mind as evening settled over Little Wickham, and she found herself receiving an unexpected visitor in the form of Dr. Geoffrey Ashford. The doctor arrived with the slightly strained appearance of a man wrestling with obligations that extended far beyond his medical expertise, ostensibly to discuss certain formalities regarding Timothy's death, though his true purpose became clear as their conversation progressed over tea in her sitting room. Dr. Ashford's friendship with Dr. Hartwell had provided him with insights into village dynamics that proved increasingly significant in light of the day's revelations. During his colleague's courtship of Eleanor, he had occasionally heard mention of family tensions regarding the Whitmore property holdings, particularly Miss Cordelia's fierce protectiveness concerning Eleanor's reputation and future security. More troubling, there had been hints that Timothy's recent windfall from the football pools had somehow complicated existing family arrangements, though the exact nature remained deliberately vague. Miss Marple observed Dr. Ashford with particular attention as he spoke, noting the way his hands moved restlessly and how his eyes avoided direct contact when discussing his interactions with the Whitmore family. His medical bag sat beside his chair, and she noticed his right hand bore an old scar across the knuckles, the raised white ridge common to those who had played cricket too enthusiastically in youth. When he mentioned having visited Miss Cordelia earlier to ensure she took proper rest, Miss Marple noted the faint scent of carbolic that clung to his clothing, the mark of someone who maintained scrupulous cleanliness in his professional duties. Their conversation was interrupted by Margaret Vance, who appeared at the cottage door in considerable distress, her earlier composure finally cracking under the weight of accumulated revelations. She confessed that her testimony to Inspector Slack had been incomplete that Timothy's questions about Eleanor's financial arrangements had been far more specific and threatening than she had initially revealed. His inquiries had focused particularly on what he termed a lost will or codicil that might significantly alter the distribution of the Whitmore estate, suggesting Eleanor was being cheated out of a substantial legacy that rightfully belonged to her. Dr. Ashford's medical expertise proved valuable in understanding the practical aspects of Timothy's death. His examination of the cake crumbs found beneath the yew tree had revealed traces of what appeared to be digitalis, the heart medication derived from foxglove plants that grew abundantly in Little Wickham's cottage gardens. The poison would have acted quickly but not instantaneously, allowing Timothy time to consume the cake and walk to the churchyard before succumbing to its effects. More significantly, digitalis was readily available to anyone with basic knowledge of herbal medicine, making the identification of the poison source virtually impossible without extensive investigation. Miss Marple's gentle suggestion that they examine the parish registers proved remarkably illuminating when the Reverend Clement produced the ancient volumes from his study. Together, they bent over pages that revealed troubling irregularities in the Whitmore family entries, particularly during a contentious decade near the turn of the century. A baptism had been added on a later line, crowded into the margin with the cramped notation, "privately baptized," while beside a burial for an infant of 6 days lay a faint erasure, the name overwritten in a hand that strained for neatness. The alignment was off by a fraction, the sort of mischief that happens when someone decides after the fact that a fact would be better recorded otherwise. The Reverend Clement murmured that the page had always struck him as untidy, though he had never investigated the irregularities more closely. Miss Marple observed that families sometimes corrected the past when it did not suit the present, particularly when inheritance matters were at stake. These documentary alterations, combined with Timothy's systematic research and his correspondence with London genealogical firms, painted a picture of someone who had discovered deliberate falsifications that threatened to expose long-buried deceptions. A visit to Mrs. Larkin at the post office yielded additional evidence that further narrowed the field of suspects. The postmistress recalled selling brown paper, pink twine, and a soft pencil around noon to a gentleman with an educated voice who apologized for not bringing proper ribbon. He had worn his hat low against the brief drizzle and smelled distinctly of carbolic, paying with a half-crown and waiting patiently for change. The calculated nature of this purchase, combined with the specific materials used in Timothy's poisoned package, suggested someone with both medical knowledge and intimate familiarity with the wedding preparations. As Miss Marple prepared for bed that evening, she reflected on how the various threads of evidence were beginning to weave together into a pattern that pointed toward someone whose present security depended entirely on keeping certain family secrets buried. Timothy's death had not been the result of sudden passion, but of cold calculation, carried out by someone who recognized that Eleanor's marriage represented a deadline that would force long-concealed truths into the open. The vault examination planned for morning would likely provide the final pieces needed to expose a deception that had been maintained for decades through careful manipulation of records and ruthless elimination of threats. The morning mist still clung to the ancient stones of St. Bartholomew's churchyard when Inspector Slack, Miss Marple, and a visibly tense Miss Cordelia gathered before the Whitmore family vault. The heavy oak door, adorned with the faded family crest, stood as a silent guardian to secrets that Timothy Whitmore had died trying to expose. Miss Marple observed how Miss Cordelia's hands trembled slightly as Inspector Slack inserted Timothy's duplicated brass key, the mechanism turning with a groan that seemed to echo through decades of carefully maintained deception. The vault's interior was smaller than expected, lined with stone shelves bearing lead coffins whose tarnished brass plaques bore witness to generations of Whitmore dead. Inspector Slack's lantern cast dancing shadows across the ancient stonework, revealing an atmosphere thick with the weight of time and secrets. Miss Marple noted immediately the signs of recent disturbance that Timothy's notebook had prepared them to expect. Fresh scratches near one memorial plaque, and candle wax on a ledge that spoke of nighttime visits conducted in secrecy. The most significant discovery lay tucked behind the largest coffin in a small iron strong box whose rusted latch yielded reluctantly to Constable Reed's efforts. Inside, carefully folded and preserved despite its age, lay a baptismal certificate dated 1895 for one Eleanor Vance, daughter of Eleanor Whitmore and an unnamed father. The document bore the seal of a distant parish, its edges slightly singed as if it had narrowly escaped deliberate destruction. This certificate represented the missing link in Timothy's genealogical research, proof that Eleanor's grandmother had been the legitimate Whitmore heir, whose existence had been systematically erased from family records. Miss Marple studied the certificate with particular attention to its implications for the current Eleanor's inheritance rights. The document established that Eleanor Hartwell, through her grandmother Eleanor Vance, possessed a direct claim to the Whitmore estate that superseded Miss Cordelia's position as family guardian. The systematic concealment of this lineage represented decades of financial fraud, with Miss Cordelia benefiting from managing an estate that rightfully belonged to Eleanor's branch of the family. Timothy's research had uncovered not just genealogical curiosity, but evidence of deliberate deception worth thousands of pounds annually. As Inspector Slack examined the certificate and its implications for the inheritance fraud, Miss Marple's attention was drawn to a detail that others overlooked in their focus on the documentary evidence. On the dusty floor near the iron box, almost invisible unless one knew what to seek, lay a faint crystalline residue that caught the lantern light with an oily sheen. Her years of gardening experience recognized this substance immediately as the natural oils found on foxglove leaves, the source of the digitalis that had killed Timothy Whitmore. This botanical evidence provided a crucial link between the vault and Timothy's murder, suggesting that his killer had handled raw foxglove plants rather than obtaining digitalis through conventional medical channels. Combined with the carbolic scent reported at the post office and the professional knowledge required for the poisoning, this residue pointed towards someone with both medical expertise and access to the vault during Timothy's research activities. Miss Marple reflected that the killer had been methodical enough to clean most traces of their presence, but had overlooked this minute detail that connected them directly to both the murder weapon and the scene of Timothy's discoveries. The vault examination revealed the complete scope of the deception that had motivated Timothy's murder. Someone had maintained a profitable lie for decades, systematically concealing Eleanor's legitimate inheritance while positioning themselves as her guardian and financial manager. Timothy's research had threatened to expose this fraud, just as Eleanor's marriage might have prompted legal review of the family finances. The killer had chosen Eleanor's wedding day not merely for convenience, but because it represented a deadline that forced their hand before Timothy could present his evidence to proper authorities. As they emerged from the vault into the grey morning light, Miss Marple observed how the various threads of evidence were converging toward a solution that would soon require careful handling. The botanical residue in the vault, combined with the systematic nature of the genealogical fraud and the calculated timing of Timothy's murder, pointed toward someone whose professional reputation and financial security depended entirely on maintaining secrets that Timothy Whitmore had finally succeeded in uncovering. The young man's death had been the desperate act of someone who recognized that their carefully constructed life was about to crumble under the weight of documentary truth. The return from the vault brought with it a weight of evidence that seemed to settle the case decisively in Inspector Slack's mind, though Miss Marple found herself increasingly troubled by details that pointed away from the obvious conclusion. While Miss Cordelia's involvement in the inheritance fraud was undeniable, the calculated precision of Timothy's murder suggested a mind more methodical and professionally trained than that of an elderly woman protecting family secrets through desperate improvisation. The botanical residue discovered in the vault proved particularly significant under closer examination. Miss Marple's extensive gardening experience allowed her to recognize that the oily crystalline traces came from fresh foxglove handling rather than dried preparations, indicating someone who had recently processed the raw plant material with considerable expertise. The systematic extraction of digitalis required precise knowledge of timing, dosage, and preparation methods that went well beyond casual familiarity with poisonous plants. Inspector Slack's methodical review of the evidence established a clear timeline of deception spanning decades, but Miss Marple observed that his focus on Miss Cordelia overlooked crucial details about the murder's execution. The carbolic scent reported at the post office, the professional knowledge required for the poisoning, and the calculated timing all pointed towards someone with medical training who had moved freely through the wedding preparations without arousing suspicion. Dr. Ashford's continued presence throughout the investigation struck Miss Marple as increasingly significant. His ostensible role as Dr. Hartwell's colleague provided perfect cover for his involvement, while his medical expertise explained both his knowledge of digitalis extraction and his ability to examine Timothy's body without revealing incriminating evidence. More tellingly, his familiarity with the wedding arrangements through his friendship with the groom had given him intimate knowledge of the informal cake packaging system that made Timothy's murder possible. The correspondence discovered between Miss Cordelia and Dr. Ashford revealed a relationship that extended far beyond casual acquaintance, with the doctor providing medical opinions about Timothy's mental state and gambling behavior over nearly 2 years. These letters suggested a level of collaboration that made Dr. Ashford privy to family concerns about Timothy's genealogical research long before it reached its dangerous conclusions. His professional standing had provided him with both the means and the opportunity to eliminate Timothy when the young man's discoveries threatened to expose the inheritance fraud. Recognizing that direct confrontation would likely prove futile against someone of Dr. Ashford's intelligence and professional training, Miss Marple arranged what appeared to be a simple social call, extending an invitation for afternoon tea with the ostensible purpose of offering condolences regarding the tragic events. Her small sitting room provided the perfect setting for observation, its cozy atmosphere and afternoon light creating an environment where careful questioning might seem like innocent conversation. Dr. Ashford arrived precisely on time, carrying his medical bag with the professional efficiency that had served him so well throughout his deception. Miss Marple noted immediately how his cheerful demeanor seemed slightly forced, and how his eyes moved restlessly around the room as if assessing potential threats to his carefully maintained facade. The faint scent of carbolic that clung to his clothing provided another link to the gentleman who had purchased the brown paper and twine used in Timothy's murder. "Such a terrible business, Doctor," Miss Marple began as she poured tea with her characteristic gentle precision, her knitting needles clicking softly beside her chair. "One can hardly believe such a thing could happen in our quiet village and on dear Eleanor's wedding day of all occasions. The poor child, to have such happiness overshadowed by tragedy." Dr. Ashford accepted his teacup with steady hands, though Miss Marple observed a slight tension in his shoulders that spoke of carefully controlled nerves. "Indeed, Miss Marple, a shocking development. Poor Timothy seemed such a harmless young man, though I understand he had been behaving rather oddly recently. Perhaps the gambling windfall affected his judgment more than anyone realized." "Yes, the football pools can certainly change a person," Miss Marple agreed pleasantly, her needles resuming their gentle rhythm. "Though I understand Timothy's interests had turned more toward family history than gambling lately. Such dedication to genealogical research, spending all those hours in the churchyard copying inscriptions. One might almost say he had discovered something particularly fascinating to maintain such persistence." She glanced up from her knitting with innocent curiosity, noting how Dr. Ashford's grip tightened almost imperceptibly on his teacup. Of course, the poison itself was quite sophisticated, wasn't it? Digitalis requires such precise knowledge to extract effectively. Not something an amateur could manage safely, I should think. The dosage calculations alone would challenge someone without proper medical training. Dr. Ashford's response came perhaps a fraction too quickly, his professional manner asserting itself with the automatic precision of someone accustomed to maintaining authority. Quite right, Miss Marple. The extraction and preparation of digitalis is decidedly complex, requiring extensive knowledge of botanical chemistry and pharmacology. Certainly not within the capabilities of someone like Timothy, despite his gardening background. How fortunate, then, that Timothy didn't attempt such a thing himself, Miss Marple observed, with gentle emphasis, her eyes meeting his directly. Though I suppose anyone with proper medical knowledge and access to fresh foxglove plants could manage the process quite efficiently. Particularly, someone familiar with the wedding preparations and the informal packaging arrangements that made such a targeted delivery possible. The silence that followed stretched between them like a taut wire, Dr. Ashford's carefully maintained composure beginning to show hairline cracks under Miss Marple's steady gaze. His hand trembled almost imperceptibly as he set down his teacup, and she noticed how his breathing had grown shallow despite his efforts to maintain professional calm. The moment hung suspended between accusation and denial, with Miss Marple waiting patiently for the critical reaction that would confirm her growing certainty about Timothy Whitmore's killer. Dr. Ashford's composure held for several heartbeats longer, his medical training serving him well in maintaining professional calm, even as Miss Marple's gentle words struck with surgical precision. When he finally responded, his voice carried the careful modulation of someone accustomed to managing difficult conversations, though beneath the surface she detected the strain of a man whose carefully constructed world was beginning to collapse. "I'm afraid I don't quite follow your meaning, Miss Marple," he said, reaching for his medical bag with movements that appeared casual, but carried an underlying tension. The investigation has established quite clearly that Miss Cordelia had both motive and opportunity for Timothy's murder. Her involvement in the inheritance fraud provides ample reason for eliminating someone who threatened to expose decades of deception. Miss Marple set down her teacup with deliberate precision, her knitting needles resuming their gentle rhythm, though her eyes remained fixed on his face with the steady attention of someone reading a particularly complex pattern. "Oh, I quite agree that Miss Cordelia has much to answer for regarding Eleanor's inheritance. However, the murder itself required capabilities that go well beyond her resources. You see, Doctor, the botanical residue found in the vault tells a very specific story." She paused to examine a stitch before continuing with the same conversational tone. "Fresh foxglove oils on the fingers of someone who had recently extracted digitalis, combined with the carbolic scent reported at the post office, suggests a medical professional who maintains scrupulous hygiene in his work. Someone who could move freely through the wedding preparations without arousing suspicion. Someone with intimate knowledge of the informal packaging system through his friendship with the groom." Dr. Ashford's hand froze halfway to his medical bag, and for the first time since entering her sitting room, his professional mask showed hairline cracks. Even if such a theory held merit, which I certainly don't concede, what possible motive could I have for harming Timothy? I barely knew the young man. But that's where you're quite wrong, Doctor. Miss Marple reached into her knitting basket and withdrew a length of pink twine. "Would you be so kind as to help me secure this parcel for the Reverend? My fingers are rather stiff today, and he does prefer things properly tied." Dr. Ashford hesitated for the briefest instant before accepting the twine, his hands moving with quiet efficiency. He tied a neat square knot, then made an additional loop and a firm second throw, the compact twist of a surgeon's knot that would never slip under pressure. "How clever," Miss Marple murmured, watching his technique with polite interest. "I never can remember that extra turn. Such a safeguard against slippage when one is securing something delicate that must not come undone." Her eyes met his directly. "The same knot found on Timothy's poisoned package, Doctor. The same knot that would occur naturally to someone whose professional training emphasized absolute security in critical moments." The silence stretched between them like a taut wire, and Miss Marple observed how perspiration had begun to bead on Dr. Ashford's forehead despite the afternoon's coolness. His breathing had grown shallow, the careful control that had served him throughout his deception finally showing signs of strain under her relentless, gentle pressure. Your connection to the Whitmore family extends far beyond casual acquaintance with Dr. Hartwell, she continued with the same gentle precision. The correspondence discovered between yourself and Miss Cordelia reveals a collaboration spanning nearly 2 years. You served as her medical advisor, certainly, but more significantly, you helped manage Eleanor's estate finances, positioning yourself to benefit substantially from maintaining the existing fraud. Dr. Ashford's medical bag slipped from his suddenly nerveless fingers, landing on her carpet with a soft thud that seemed to echo through the small sitting room. The transformation from respected medical professional to cornered killer was subtle but unmistakable, his cheerful demeanor replaced by something colder and more calculating. Timothy discovered the inheritance fraud weeks ago, Miss Marple observed, her voice carrying the weight of absolute certainty. His correspondence with London genealogists would have exposed Miss Cordelia's deception within days of Eleanor's return from her honeymoon. But you realized that the scandal would also destroy your own carefully cultivated position as the family's trusted advisor. The annual fees from managing Eleanor's estate, the professional standing, the comfortable security of your established practice, all of it would have vanished once the fraud came to light. Before Dr. Ashford could respond, the telephone rang in the passage with urgent insistence. Miss Marple rose to answer, listening without interruption before returning with composed gravity. Inspector Slack, from Vicarage Lane. Miss Cordelia has collapsed after receiving an anonymous package. There appears to be poison involved, though she lives. He requests a doctor immediately. Dr. Ashford was already reaching for his bag, professional instincts asserting themselves despite his compromised position. I'll go at once. How fortunate, Miss Marple observed quietly, that you happened to be here when such expertise was needed, though I suspect Inspector Slack will be very interested in examining whatever materials you might have in that bag, particularly any remaining traces of digitalis or botanical residues. And Mrs. Larkin's excellent memory for voices will prove quite valuable when she identifies the gentleman who purchased brown paper and twine yesterday morning. Dr. Ashford straightened slowly, his medical bag clutched in hand that trembled almost imperceptibly. The desperate calculation in his eyes spoke of a man weighing impossible options, recognizing that his carefully maintained facade had finally crumbled beyond repair. The afternoon light streaming through Miss Marple's windows cast everything in sharp relief, illuminating the moment when Dr. Geoffrey Ashford's double life as respected physician and calculating murderer reached its inevitable conclusion. Timothy's death wasn't enough, was it, Doctor? Miss Marple asked with gentle understanding. When Miss Cordelia became a liability rather than an ally, you decided she too must be silenced. But unlike Timothy, she survived your second attempt, and now Inspector Slack will have all the evidence he needs to connect you to both crimes. The silence that followed was absolute, broken only by the distant sound of approaching footsteps on the garden path, as Inspector Slack and Constable Reed arrived to take Dr. Ashford into custody for the murder of Timothy Whitmore and the attempted murder of Miss Cordelia Whitmore. The sound of approaching footsteps on the garden path announced Inspector Slack's arrival with Constable Reed, their expressions carrying the grim satisfaction of men who had finally assembled the pieces of a complex puzzle. Dr. Ashford rose from his chair with the measured composure that had served him throughout his deception, though Miss Marple observed how his hands trembled almost imperceptibly as he reached for his medical bag. The inspector's tone remained courteous but decisive as he explained that Miss Cordelia required immediate medical attention, having collapsed after receiving what appeared to be poisoned confections, and that Dr. Ashford's expertise was urgently needed. The examination of Dr. Ashford's medical bag proved immediately revealing when Inspector Slack requested permission to inspect its contents as a precautionary measure. Hidden beneath the standard instruments lay a small vial of concentrated digitalis extract, prepared with the clinical precision that only extensive medical knowledge could provide. More damning still were traces of foxglove oil on his surgical instruments and a carefully wrapped packet of dried foxglove leaves, accompanied by a pestle and mortar bearing the distinctive residue of recent botanical preparation. The systematic nature of these materials spoke to premeditation rather than impulse, the methodical planning of someone who had calculated murder with professional efficiency. Mrs. Larkin's arrival provided the crucial identification that sealed Dr. Ashford's fate. The postmistress took one look at the doctor and declared with quiet certainty that his was the educated voice of the gentleman who had purchased brown paper, pink twine, and a soft pencil on the wedding morning. Her mention of the distinctive carbolic scent that had clung to the purchaser's clothing provided another link in the chain of evidence that connected Dr. Ashford directly to Timothy's poisoned package. Miss Marple set down her knitting with deliberate precision as she began to weave together the threads of evidence that had accumulated throughout their investigation. "The pattern has become quite clear, Inspector," she observed with gentle authority. Dr. Ashford's position as the family's trusted medical advisor provided him with intimate knowledge of both the inheritance fraud and Eleanor's financial arrangements. Timothy's genealogical research threatened not merely Miss Cordelia's deception, but Dr. Ashford's profitable role as estate manager and consultant, a position that had enabled him to embezzle substantial sums through falsified medical expenses and inflated administrative fees. She continued with the methodical precision that had characterized her approach throughout the case. The wedding day represented a deadline that forced his hand. Once Eleanor returned from her honeymoon, her new husband would naturally take interest in her financial affairs, and Timothy's discoveries would inevitably come to light. Dr. Ashford possessed the medical expertise to extract concentrated digitalis from fresh foxglove plants, the professional knowledge to calculate a lethal dosage, and the surgical training that produced the distinctive knot found on Timothy's package. His friendship with Dr. Hartwell provided perfect cover for his movements during the wedding preparations. Dr. Ashford's facade of professional composure finally cracked under the weight of accumulated evidence. "You have constructed an elegant theory, Miss Marple," he said with bitter resignation. "But theories require proof beyond mere speculation." However, his defiance proved hollow when confronted with the physical evidence, witness testimony, and Miss Cordelia's survival to provide crucial testimony about their years of collaboration in managing Eleanor's estate. Inspector Slack's formal caution was administered with the gravity appropriate to such serious charges, though Dr. Ashford made no attempt to resist or deny the accusations. His transformation from respected village physician to exposed murderer was complete. The cheerful professional demeanor replaced by cold calculation that had always lurked beneath the surface. The attempted poisoning of Miss Cordelia through chocolates laced with an even more concentrated dose of digitalis demonstrated his willingness to eliminate any witness who might expose his crimes. As Constable Reed led Dr. Ashford away into the gathering dusk, Miss Marple reflected on how the pursuit of financial security had corrupted a man whose medical training should have dedicated him to preserving life rather than destroying it. The inheritance fraud that had begun decades earlier with Miss Cordelia's well-intentioned deception had created the conditions for Timothy's murder, demonstrating once again how old secrets inevitably demanded new victims to maintain their concealment. The village of Little Wickham would recover from this shock, as villages always did, though the knowledge that one of their most trusted figures had been capable of such calculated evil would leave permanent shadows. Eleanor's wedding day, meant to celebrate new beginnings, had instead exposed the deadly consequences of buried truths, reminding all present that human nature's capacity for both good and evil often lay hidden beneath the most respectable facades. The quiet that settled over Miss Marple's sitting room after Dr. Ashford's departure seemed to echo with the weight of revelations that had transformed a respected physician into an exposed murderer. The lingering scent of carbolic and the abandoned teacup on her table served as tangible reminders that evil could wear the most respectable of masks, a truth that little Wickham would struggle to accept in the days ahead. News of Dr. Ashford's arrest spread through the village with the swiftness that accompanies truly shocking developments, eclipsing even the initial horror of Timothy's murder. The revelation that their trusted doctor had been systematically embezzling from Eleanor's inheritance while maintaining a facade of professional integrity struck at the very foundations of community trust. Conversations in the tea shop and post office took on hushed, incredulous tones as villagers recalled past interactions with Dr. Ashford, searching for signs they might have missed of the calculating mind behind his cheerful demeanor. Miss Cordelia's recovery from the poisoned chocolates proved slow but steady, her survival providing crucial testimony that sealed Dr. Ashford's fate. The older woman's cooperation with Inspector Slack revealed the full extent of the deception that had shaped Eleanor's life for decades. While her original concealment of Eleanor's legitimate birth had been motivated by protective instincts, fearing social ostracism in less tolerant times, the arrangement had gradually evolved into a comfortable fraud that benefited both herself and Dr. Ashford through their management of Eleanor's rightful inheritance. Eleanor and Dr. Hartwell returned from their abbreviated honeymoon to find their world transformed by revelations that cast their future in an entirely new light. The young bride's response to learning about her true inheritance displayed the quiet strength that had always characterized her nature. Rather than bitterness toward Miss Cordelia's well-intentioned deception, Eleanor expressed understanding for the social pressures that had motivated the concealment, focusing instead on ensuring that Timothy's sacrifice had not been meaningless. Dr. Ashford's confession, delivered with the clinical precision that had characterized his crimes, revealed a mind capable of calculating murder with professional efficiency. His embezzlement had begun modestly with inflated medical expenses, gradually expanding to encompass substantial diversions of rental income and investment returns. Timothy's genealogical research had threatened not merely exposure, but complete financial ruin, as the young man's discoveries would have triggered comprehensive audits revealing years of systematic theft. The attempted murder of Miss Cordelia through digitalis-laced chocolates had been equally methodical, designed to eliminate the one witness who could connect him to the fraud. The legal resolution proved complex but ultimately favorable to Eleanor's interests. The baptismal certificate discovered in the family vault, combined with Timothy's meticulous research, established her claim beyond reasonable doubt. Dr. Ashford's assets would be liquidated to recover the embezzled funds, while Miss Cordelia's cooperation earned her clemency from prosecution, though she would spend her remaining years in reduced circumstances as penance for her long deception. As autumn settled over Little Wickham, the village gradually found its rhythm again, though the knowledge that respectability could mask such calculated evil would remain a sobering reminder. The ancient yew tree in St. Bartholomew's churchyard stood as a silent witness to the transient nature of human ambition, while Timothy's grave in the newer section bore a simple headstone acknowledging his role in bringing truth to light. Miss Marple observed how the young couple faced these revelations with mature grace, their marriage strengthened rather than weakened by adversity. Dr. Hartwell's practice would benefit from Eleanor's restored financial security, enabling them to serve the community more effectively while building the family life they had planned. The shadow cast over their wedding day would fade with time, though Timothy's dedication to uncovering truth would ensure his memory endured. In her final reflections on the case, Miss Marple pondered the curious ways human nature revealed itself under pressure. Dr. Ashford's transformation from healer to killer demonstrated how the pursuit of financial security could corrupt even those whose professional calling demanded the preservation of life. His systematic approach to murder, disguised behind professional competence and social respectability, reminded her once again that the most dangerous criminals were often those who appeared most trustworthy. The pink roses climbing over her cottage gate were preparing for winter's rest as Miss Marple settled into her evening routine, her knitting needles clicking with familiar rhythm. Evil had been exposed and justice served, though at terrible cost in young life lost and trust betrayed. Little Wickham would heal, as villages always did, but the bride who had smiled so radiantly would now inherit her rightful legacy, while justice had finally caught up with those who had thought themselves clever enough to murder with impunity.